What's up YouTube, Capital G here, talking about Majespecters in this video and why they suck but they shouldn't. Let me just start off by saying when I first saw Majespecters coming out of Dimension of Chaos, I looked at the archetype and I thought to myself, holy jeez, we have finally gotten to the point where power creep is out of control. We just released an entire archetype that cannot be targeted and can't be destroyed by card effects, and it's a pendulum based archetype, which means that even when you finally do destroy the monsters, they're just going to come back on top of that. And you know, every single monster in the archetype has kind of like this really nice +1 effect. You summon the raccoon and it searches any monster, you summon the fox and it gets a trap card, you get the toad and you get the set like a trap card straight from your deck. So when I first saw the archetype, I thought that it was insane. I thought that because of what I like to call the adjustment, the power creep, I thought that they were going to be around for a very long time. But then you started looking at the deck and you realized that it was sort of more of an anti-meta pendulum deck, which is perfectly fine, and it could obviously be solid. It has topped some YCSs before. I believe that it's made it all the way to a top 4 at YCS, but I want to talk about why you don't see Majespecters see any play in today's meta, despite the fact that they still have that adjustment, the power creep. You still cannot target the entire archetype of card effects. They're still immune to things like Interrupted Slumber and Regeki and Dark Hole and all those spiral sleeper effects that can be annoying and can blow up your monsters. Majespecters should be in a pretty decent situation, but they just aren't, and I want to talk about why that is. So one of the first things that becomes abundantly clear when you look at the Majespector archetype, especially in comparison to other pendulum archetypes from the Arc V era, is that the attack values being so low for Majespectors is a serious problem, because it means that the deck has to solely rely on its trap cards to be like the play disrupting cards, to be their form of defense. If you look at other pendulum archetypes from Arc V, you look at things like Dino Mist and something like Metaphors, they do have trap cards that can be defensive, that can possibly, kind of be disruptive, cards like Metaphor's Counter or Dino Mist Howling. But because their monsters have higher attack values, that isn't the only form of those decks actually defending themselves. And one of the problems was initially when these cards came out of Dimension of Chaos, they were pretty solid cards, but Majespector Tempest, which was a Solemn Strike, a searchable Solemn Strike, albeit, and it was a really decent card, but in the very next set, Breaker of Shadows, Konami released the official Solemn Strike, and it gave pretty much every deck Majespector Tempest, and obviously it was a lot stronger because it didn't require you to tribute a monster, so they almost power creep these cards right out of the gates. And one of the things that make Majespectors inherently strong, their invulnerability to like targeting, makes them, or makes a card like Majespector Tornado extremely bad. If you ever are dealing with another archetype that can't be targeted, Spiral for instance, because of the Spiral Resort card, then this card becomes extremely dead against those matchups. So their trap cards seem pretty solid coming out the gate, but they were actually power creeped extremely fast. You look at like the Cosmo matchup and the fact that getting Dark Destroyer off the board is almost impossible for a deck like Majespectors. And I actually struggle with this a lot when I play Alter, guys. If my opponent puts a really big card on the field, like a Leo Dancer or a pumped up Deco Talker, if my targeting has been removed as a viable source of removal, then I can't really get rid of that monster because I know that my archetype is just limited by the attack value. So Majespectors are kind of in that same boat. If your opponent puts a really big untargetable monster on the field, maybe something like a Spiral Sleeper that is, pumped up by a resort, then you really won't have an answer to it, and that's a monster that you're almost certainly going to lose the duel to. The second thing I want to talk about is how much Majespectors really suffer when you put their monsters in the pendulum zones, and it's something that definitely is the Achilles heel of the archetype in my opinion. They don't have pendulum effects, which I'm actually perfectly fine with because, as I said earlier, they've been adjusted to power creep. They can't be destroyed by card effects. They can't be targeted in any way. So I feel like there's a little bit of give and take, and during the Arc V era, we saw some extremely broken pendulum effects. Everything from the Cleaford Scouts to, perform a Power Monkey board. We saw entire archetypes have incredibly strong utility effects when they're in the Pendulum Scales. Look at something like Metaphors. And then we saw the final evolution be, I guess, like the Pendulum Magicians, the Zark ones, cards like Purple Poison that can actually activate during either player's turn and can have like kind of nice disruptive effects. But Majespecters don't get any of that. They don't really benefit in any way when they're in the Pendulum Zones other than giving the deck the ability to actually Pendulum Summon. The real problem is not the fact that they don't have Pendulum effects, it's the fact that their scales are so damn narrow. I will not understand, or I guess I will never understand why Konami made their scales so narrow, but when you look at other Pendulum archetypes, if you look at like Metaphors, they have these super wide scales of like 1 and 8. Pendulum Magicians is the same way, whether you look at the new Supreme Magicians where you have like 0 and 10, or you even go back to like the old school Magicians where you have like 1 and 8. Not only did it give the deck a wide variety of potentially splashing in a lot of cards that could be boss monsters, which Majespecters also suffer with. I mean, the fact that they couldn't really effectively play Majespector Kirin was kind of a joke, but every other Pendulum archetype could. Metaphors, Pendulum Magicians, they're the reasons that Majespector Kirin got banned. It wasn't even because of Majespecters. So not only are you basically limited by what you can actually play, but now you're suffering like triple because you're not getting any use out of your monsters when they're in the Pendulum Zones during either player's turns. Even Cleaford, which is, I guess, the most bare bones of effects where the Cleaford monsters get a little stronger or your opponent's monsters get a little weaker, like Majespecters don't even benefit in that way. You now don't really have any boss monsters for the archetype. I know that they have an Exceed card that basically in today's Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't do anything, but if you look at all these Pendulum decks from like the Arc V era, you look at some of the strong ones, even the ones that didn't have great on-field effects like Metaphors, where the monsters are vanillas. Metaphors could run things like Apex Avion, they could run Majespector Kirin, so they weren't completely reliant on the trap cards because they could have monsters that play defense at the same time, and they could summon these big powerful boss monsters that could actually stop your opponent from doing what they wanted to do. Imagine if Majespecters right now could actually Pendulum Summon like 2 copies of Apex Avion turn 1 and then normal summon like, a Fox and then set like a Majespector Tornado or a Majespector Tempest. That'd be pretty damn, that'd be almost an uncrackable board if you were going first. Your opponent wouldn't be able to evenly match you. They wouldn't be able to disrupt pretty much anything that you were going to do, and that would put the archetype in a whole nother level. Next up is Master Rule 4, and obviously Master Rule 4 hurt the Pendulum mechanic as a whole, but I feel like Majespecters probably got the worst end of it because the most successful ways that Majespecters were playing with like Demise and Ties of the Brethren, that was just devastated because usually what Majespecters wanted to do was they kind of wanted to make a pretty strong board turn 1 and they wanted to just sit behind a billion trap cards and make it so that their opponent could never really crack their initial board, and then maybe set their scales and then Pendulum Summon and search more trap cards, and you'd kind of overwhelm your opponent with the trap cards and with your defensive cards within the first couple of turns, like any good stun deck really wants to do. The problem was if you put cards in your Pendulum Zones, then you're really limited on how many trap cards you can have in your back row. You're limited to just 3 cards now, and the Majespecters, because of the trap and the spell cards where they all require tributes, you have to have monsters on the board to be able to constantly use them. The fact that you can no longer Pendulum 5 from the extra deck really hurts because Majespecters is not a deck that can afford to just be Pendulum summoning 1 card from their extra deck at a time, because now you're thinking, all right, now I can only use 1 of those trap cards when I used to be able to Pendulum summon 3 or 4. I'd get 3 or 4 searches and I'd be able to use 3 or 4 cards. It's just Master Rule 4 really like almost made this deck, I don't want to say it made it unplayable, but it severely crippled it. And then the final thing is, and this one is at least temporary, so you can take solace in that, I think your core matchups right now are borderline unwinnable. That would be Spiral and Trickstar. Those are the 2 best decks in the TCG until we get our new ban list. The Spiral matchup is an absolute nightmare. One of your biggest trap cards, one of the cards that the deck relies on. Majespector Tornado is basically unplayable in the matchup. You can't target any of their monsters while they actually have, the Spiral Resort up. Maybe you can hit something like a Gofu, but for the most part, if you're playing against an entire archetype where you can't use one of your 2 searchable trap cards, you're not going to win many duels. Same thing kind of goes for the Trickstar match. You know, Trickstar are a deck where they only kind of play like 3 Trickstar core monsters. They have the Stratos and Candina, Lycoris is the burn card, and then they have the Poker and Lilybell, and you really can't a lot of times use a Tornado on a Candina, because if your opponent ever has that Lycoris in their hand, all they have to do is bounce it, they summon the Lycoris, they still get a Surge, and then you've essentially lost 2 cards on your field while they probably have an open field. And the fact that the Trickstar Light Stage can constantly lock down your back row every single turn is a nightmare. I've played the matchup, it's almost unwinnable. So in conclusion, just kind of to recap, Majespecters do have some potential, but I think there are just too many things going against them right now. The 4 key pieces being, number 1, their searchable trap cards they just kind of been power creeped, and they got power creeped really quick. Majespecter Tempest is kind of just a poor man's version of Solemn Strike, which is a much better card. Majespecter Tornado is unplayable in certain matchups like Spiral, where they just, you can't really use the card against. The fact that their Pendulum Scales do not allow you to run awesome things like Astrograph Magician, they don't allow you to run real boss monsters like Apex Avion, definitely hurts the archetype. The fact that Master Rule 4 really did a number, especially being able to pendulum summon only 1 monster at a time from the extra deck, really hurts when you're required to give up a tribute every time that you activate one of your spells and trap cards, so that definitely doesn't bode well for them. And then their core matchups, like the 2 biggest matchups in the meta right now, are basically unwinnable because of the stuff that I just talked about. So maybe in the future, Majespecters will be revived, but I just don't see it right now. So whatever you guys think, leave it in the comment section below. Do you guys think that Majespecters could possibly make a meta return? What do you think about Majespecters? And if you guys actually did enjoy this video, there were a couple of other decks that I was thinking about making similar videos to this too. If you guys think that that's a good idea, leave that in the comment section as well. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already. Turn on that notification bell for daily videos.